Well, I guess we'll just go ahead and sit. I mean, is that okay with you guys?
Sure.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, thank you for coming. We're going to be talking about 505(b)(2) drug development. Presumably you got some interest in that. So at least now we'll be talking this morning about some of the things that you should be considering early on in your development in order to position yourself for future success. This slide here shows the potential value, we believe, in 505(b)(2) drug development. This slide shows you, for drugs that were approved in each of the years, what the median value, actually the average value, this was the mean value, of the revenue of these drugs over years. So that you can see drugs, for example, in 2011, it took a little while before they took off. You can see, but by 2013, the average value, or at least the average revenue, was around $50-some-odd million. That's how you read that. And we need to update this slide for more recent ones. Sure.
Is it common to see revenue increases linear rather than exponential? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's probably kind of unusual, isn't it? I think it would be a bit unusual because, again, this is, I think in 2012 there were probably low 40s number of drugs approved, 505(b)(2s approved. So this is the average, and how that came out this way, who knows? I'm going to guess that if you took an individual drug, you'd certainly see it curve because you have uptake, right? Stocking, okay, depends on the revenue there, and sales, so I don't know. But it's fascinating to look at it and say, well, what can I expect with my drug, maybe, you hope. Now, that's the good news. Here's the potential bad news. So here we're talking about drugs in the exact same category, very, very similar drugs. And as you can see, there's some drugs that have done quite well. And unfortunately, there's some drugs that have done very, very poorly. Even the little red one down at the bottom there, even through 7 months after launch, I wouldn't say that's probably got too much success in its future either. So it begs the question, why? Why do some drugs succeed and some drugs fail? On the surface, these drugs are pretty much the same. They look the same indications, pretty much the same kinds of drugs. So our thesis is that some of the reasons why these drugs fail is because they were never planned correctly to begin with, and they're suffering that fate. And that fate is that oftentimes we don't know where we're going. We start off, we've got some ideas, but the thesis is that if you don't know exactly where you're going to go, any road will get you there. And so this morning we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to consider very, very early on in your development and the life of your company in order to make sure that you succeed. It's really, really critical in 505(b)(2) drug development in particular, and I'm going to try to explain to you why this morning, why that one's different than some of the, either a generic or a normal B1. But in 505(b)(2), there's things that you have to do much, much earlier than your experience with, for example, if you're experienced in B1 development. We're doing things much, much earlier in B2 development than you might expect. And it's one of the reasons why, if you don't do that, it's one of the reasons why there isn't success later on. So our thesis is that early on you need to consider these 4 quadrants of development. And I'm going to go through in detail each one of these. The first one is the regulatory. And that's what most people think about when they think about B2s, don't they? I mean, after all, 505(b)(2) is a regulation. And so, gosh, they're thinking, well, I need to figure out the regulatory. And for a lot of people, that's where it stops. It says, okay, I'll figure out the regulatory piece. I'm going to go more than that. The science portion of it, again, describe it a little bit, but that's pretty much what you guys tend to bring to the table. You've got it figured out. You know what the drug is. You kind of figured that part out. You know how to make it. You're pretty sure you know how to make it. And so you got that kind of figured out. You kind of know how it's going to work. The medical side, you probably think, well, I got that too. I know who I'm going to be dosing, treating. And we're going to hear more about that from my colleague here. She's going to emphasize that you probably don't know as much as you think you know about the medical aspect. I will say that we've been working, Camargo, I've been doing this now for our company. I should say, has been doing this for over 14 years. And we currently have some 70 drug products in development right now for clients all over the world. And I would say that the vast majority of them do not have the medical part anywhere close to being figured out when they come to us. And then the commercial, and you're going, okay, Ken, wait, I'm just starting to develop this drug. I don't need to worry about the commercial part. I'm going to partner this out anyway, or that's down the road. That's somebody else's problem. And that's one of the reasons why that earlier slide said that some of these drugs fail is because you didn't think about the commercial thing early enough. So let me go through each one of these in more detail. Let's talk about the regulatory. So this morning, had a really nice conversation. I had, like you did, probably had meetings early on. So I had my 7:30 meeting, and the company was saying, Ken, we've got this great drug, you know, we got this technology, crystals and nano something and bioavailability, all this great stuff. So I got the science, I got great science. And then I said, what's the indication? Well, the indication is, well, this is kind of what we're thinking about. So they spent many years, several years actually, developing this formulation. They've actually done some in vitro animal studies and so forth. And as of this morning, at least, they still don't have a clear idea what their indication is. Okay? And it's not like you get to pick any old indication. It's got to be something the FDA is going to accept. And moreover, and I'm going to give you a clue later, you've got to be an indication that's going to have a compelling commercial sense to it as well. And then in 505(b)(2), and by the way, I'm not going to explain everything, all the tricks in this trade, but I'm going to give you some highlights. What public information can be relied on? In 505(b)(2) drug development, the whole idea is that you're able to get your drug approved based upon relying on some information from the public domain. There's a lot of information out there. What you're typically doing is taking some drug and doing something with it. You're changing the indication, you're changing route of administration, the dose, the dosage form, you're changing all those kinds of things, right? So your goal is to leverage what's already known about the drug and do the studies that you need to do to show that your particular change to the drug is going to cause you to be successful at the end. Most people don't understand how you use the public information. You don't know how to leverage that information to the max. And what typically will happen is that you miss some of the literature or misunderstand how to leverage that, and you end up with a development plan, if you were to try to do this yourselves, that takes longer, costs more, and has more risk than you ordinarily would have. We have plenty of examples on our website to show you. For example, a client came to us with a $23 million program. It turned out to be a $6 million program, simply because they misunderstood how to use the public information. And it's critical that you get the FDA to agree on what information you can use and information you can't use, because you can't use everything. And knowing what stuff you can use and what you can't use probably takes some, I'm going to say, some expertise, some experience. And then what studies need to be conducted? You're probably going to have to do some studies, not all the time. We've actually have NDAs when we had them back in May, I guess it was. No, not May. April. We had an NDA approved where the client had to do no studies. Now, don't rush out and think that you can do many of those. But we've had a handful, probably more than a handful over the years we've been doing this that have that. But most of the time you have to do some studies. And wouldn't it be nice, when you start your development, if you knew what every study was going to be? If you knew what the study designs were, if you knew what the study cost was, if you knew the study timelines, and therefore you knew the risks involved with that, wouldn't it be great to know that before you start? Vast majority of the clients that come to us don't know that, and that's what they're looking for, clarity on that. And the other thing is, I'll say the when and the how. Again, this morning, again, many times people think that they talk about the tox studies, or in other words, we call them preclinical studies. And preclinical comes from the idea that in normal drug development, B1 drug development, you need to do some toxicology studies before you can introduce the drug to man. Well, that doesn't always happen on B2 development because we've got these drugs that have already been studied in a variety of ways. And so it's not only possible, but it's not uncommon that we're able to convince the FDA to move the preclinical to later on. For example, during phase 3. What would the valuation of your company be looking like today if you knew that you could get to proof of concept without doing toxicology studies? Toxicology studies might take you a year or 2 years. What if we could find a way to take that and move that later on and get you right into the human studies right away and get to proof of concept within a couple of years? What would that change the valuation of a company? Not bad, would it? We've actually got examples where we moved preclinical to phase 4, meaning post-approval. The reason why, of course, is because some of these older drugs were approved many, many years ago when we didn't have the tox requirements we do today. But at the end of the day, they weren't really, really required. I mean, the checkbox wasn't required to do the new studies for approval, so they got commitment to do it afterwards. So there's an example of preclinical being done post-approval. I know it sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's possible.
Question.
Sure.
Can you give us one example of where, because I know, say, for example, if you've got an orally delivered drug and you're reformulated for a topical drop in the eye, versus what example you're citing where the FDA, and there's tons of safety data on it, right, orally, versus the example of you're saying, is it delivery, change in delivery modality, is it a change in the chemical composition? What is the one example that you're
Well, I can give you an example. I can give you a great example. Mitomycin was approved for an ophthalmic indication, and the client did no studies at all. No tox, nor clinical. It's all from the public literature. All. They did nothing. They did some CMC work, of course, because they had to make formulation for the eye. But otherwise, they didn't do anything. There's plenty of information for them. But drop your card, and we can give you some examples of, because I have slides from other presentations that go through in detail the drugs that were approved with preclinical post-approval. Scientific. This is probably one of the biggest, or not biggest, the single most common reason that 505(b)(2) drugs don't even launch is CMC. That is, it's doing the formulation. The mistake is that you rely on the contract manufacturing organization, the CMO. You rely on them to set everything, the specifications and so forth. You're a small company, you don't have the expertise, and you think you can go to them to have, like one to a contractor to build a house, that you can get that done. The one thing I would suggest is you probably don't want that contractor doing your interior decorating. Okay? So what we have here is a situation where too often you rely on the CMO. The CMO doesn't have that expertise. They'll try to help you out, but at the end of the day, the single reason why drugs don't get approved or they fail to launch is CMC and 505(b)(2). And one of the major reasons for this is that at phase 1, and phase 1, as I mentioned, is the bridging study. This is where you bridge your drug, your formulation, to the existing public information in some fashion. That formulation has to be at commercial stage. That's so much earlier than you would normally do this under B1 development. But it's one of the biggest mistakes that you see. The alternative, of course, is you have to redo your program later, because if you don't have it, you fail. And one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, they don't normally do B2s. They did one, and they failed to submit a bridging study in their NDA. The NDA was rejected, was refused to file, and the project ceased because they didn't understand 505(b)(2). Medical, I'm not going to go too much into this because I've got a doctor here that's going to be emphasizing this more often, but at the end of the day, what are you solving? Are you solving a problem, or you've got a technology? Hopefully your technology is there to solve some problem. But tell us what your problem is, and why does your problem do it better? I mean, why does your product do it better? How do you solve the problem? It's not about you, not about your staff, not about the gee whiz technology. At the end of the day, you have to help some patients. Again, I'm not going to emphasize that too much more because at least we'll talk about that, but solve a problem.
Quick question. When you're, in your personal experience, when you're describing the problem, do you focus on patient health, or do you actually talk about the technicality of your product, saying, you know, existing products fail to meet this criteria, we're fixing that problem? Or do you simply say X million people die or suffer from this disease, that's the problem?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, so as a clinician, and I still see patients, it's remarkable how many technologies come to market where no one's really understood what's the differentiating value to that patient or provider.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's both, and I'll talk about this in a couple later slides. I think you often see pitches where people say, oh, there's, you know, for example, in osteoarthritis where we work, 150 million people worldwide with the disease, but the reality is, you know, which part of that disease are you going to solve with your program?
Right.
And when you whittle that down, for us, it's only going to be 800,000 patients, right, in a repeated basis. So that's a very different number than what you started with, and I think that differentiation comes down to what does your product do and where is it going to fit into that landscape. But I think that's the biggest place that I've seen products fail on launch from a clinical standpoint, is no one's really asked the question of, okay, yes, the market looks huge, but how are we going to really provide a differentiating value such that the clinician's either going to switch their current practice habits, which don't underestimate that, is very high. I think the bar to switching treatments. So you really have to show what the technical value is, and that can be, depends if you're a therapeutic device, et cetera. But yeah, that's the key, is what's going to entice a physician to change their prescribing practices, and so that's where the technical value comes in. But it has to be mirrored with the commercial opportunity.
Technology is just your enabling vehicle to do whatever you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, the next slide, I guess, is the commercial. Will the healthcare providers, generalized to clinicians and the general population, will they prefer your product? And the next thing, to add to what you're saying, even you can get doctors to, maybe convince the doctors to prescribe it, but what's the reimbursement policy going to be? Can the patient afford it? Can the entire system, let's say, afford the medication at the price that you need in order to get sufficient return on investment? Too often we see a good product that we can't get a price for, that we can't get a reimbursement for. The market's too crowded, there's not enough change to the system. Again, the system's beyond the patient and the doctor, and it's unfortunate. I mean, this is the world we live in right now. There's only so much money available in healthcare, and so it's going to be divvied out. So you need to find out very, very early on that you have a viable commercial product. And this is, I can get on my high horse here, because at Camargo, our goal is to achieve commercial success for our clients' projects. And it sounds like that's not altruistic, because it sounds like it's crass commercialization. But I will tell you that we can't deliver drugs to the patients we really care about unless it's commercially viable. Those drugs I showed you that didn't have a revenue, they didn't have product on there either, and there was no patients getting those drugs. So at the end of the day, we've got to make sure it's commercially viable. And again, so you're saying, well, Ken, come on, I'm going to license this out in phase 2, so I really don't need to know about this sort of stuff. I beg your pardon? You can't promote a drug unless it has information on the labeling. how do you get that information in the labeling? First, I got to develop the whole story, I commit to the FDA, the indication, identify the relevant patient population. Relevant, in other words, a way to say that would be addressable. What is it you can actually achieve? Who are you actually going to be able to deliver this drug to? And that's a combination of need, cost, and so forth. Combination of several of those things. And our thesis is you cannot develop a commercially viable drug unless you thought about this early on. Not more than thought about it, but you investigate this, and you have this. So, just a couple of other things, just to shed more light on this. One of the ways in which you kind of gather your thoughts in this area is called Target Product Profile, TPP. It's something the FDA expects to see early on. And how you read this, I think, oops, that doesn't do it. Yeah, okay. So what you read is some of the things some of the product characteristics are on your left-hand side here. And this is, we'll call it the reference list of the drug, but this is the, could be the current therapeutic regimen, could be, if, for example, you have an unmet need, so this would be a description of what doctors do. I mean, at some point in time, they do something, okay? So this is what is currently being done, and the way this is laid out was, well, this is what we really like, and this is, well, this is what we can accept, okay? But what you're doing for each of these areas, and we don't need to read through all these things, but is to say that it's to describe all the characteristics and why your drug is better than whatever is the current practice or whatever the current drug that you're comparing it to. And sometimes if there's more than one column here, you could have multiple therapeutic options for whatever this disease is. So you'd be comparing those to your particular product. But there's many purposes for this. As I mentioned, the FDA wants to see it. They want to know what your labeling is going to look like. They want to know what's going to be expected of them when it comes to making decisions about labeling. And think about what they're thinking. They're not thinking necessarily of all the words on there, but they're trying to think about what kind of evidence the FDA needs to be able to allow you to put in those words. So what support will you need by the time you get your NDA to support the labeling that's going to allow you to make these kinds of claims? Okay? So it's not about getting your drug approved. It's about getting labeling that allow you to get this product on the market, if you understand that distinction. So you're also using this in terms of for formularies or reimbursement. We're also trying to find out how this positions in the marketplace. We're going to try to figure out, we'll have other rows there to be able to enable us to look at cost and so forth to figure out what the reimbursement strategy might be.
Great. Thanks, Ken. So just by way of introduction, Elise Weekend, CEO and founder of Cocoon Biotech and a clinician by training. So I thought today it'd be helpful just to give you an example of the 505(b)(2) process and also just in terms of how to think about the keys to success for an early stage 505(b)(2) company. And I think the first, which we've touched upon already, is really patient-centered innovation. I think many people say, well, we'll just take an existing drug, we'll change it into an injectable, and that will sell. And the answer is, well, if you haven't gone back to the base case of what's the need in that market for that patient, that will fall flat on its face. And I think we saw some examples of those 505(b)(2)s that have been successful and those that have not. And I think that's paramount to any company, but in particular in the 505(b)(2) space. And with that, coming back to your question, it's about what makes you unique technically, and I think that's both technically on the science side, but also on the clinical side. So how are you going to differentiate? Is it based on efficacy? Is it based on safety? Is it based on compliance? Meaning you're going to deliver a product for a longer period of time, and therefore patients will take it more regularly. There's all sorts of interesting ways you can think about what makes you unique. And then the last is, I think, in particular with 505(b)(2)s is figuring out how to be capital efficient. So that's a real differentiator from the NCE pathway, 505(b)(1) pathway, where you know, I think you can really articulate to investors and partners that this is a quicker path. Not always quicker, but sometimes more efficient. But also just in terms of the capital requirements, you can bridge to these studies, so you're able to kind of leverage a wider array of data than that of which you have to generate yourself. So our company, Cocoon, is focused on using silk fibrin as a drug delivery material. So we take the raw cocoon and extract out silk fibrin, which is a protein that can be formulated into a hydrogel that we can load with small molecular protein drugs for delivery. And our lead indication is osteoarthritis. And so, you know, again, by way of emphasizing the importance of patient-centered innovation, there's 39 million people in the United States alone, about 150 million worldwide. But where do we sit within the paradigm of current treatment options? And so if you break down OA, it's categorized by mild OA, moderate, and severe, with mild being covered by oral NSAIDs and Tylenol, and moderate by the injectable categories of injectable steroids or hyaluronic acid, and then severe patients undergo surgery. So unfortunately, there's not very effective treatment options here, and the way we thought about it was there's a great oral drug, an NSAID, that currently can't be used in about a third of patients because of safety concerns, and so there's black box warnings on stroke risk and cardiovascular risk, and you say, well, wait a minute, this is a fantastic drug that really is just not being used because of systemic safety concerns. So what if we took that drug and we injected it locally into the joint? So I'll get to the product in just a second. But as I mentioned, it's so important to break down the market. When we go to talk to investors, the first thing they ask is, what is your addressable markets? And they know when you start with a slide like that, that that's not the number of patients that you're going to be treating. And I think most companies don't take the time, and we learned that through multiple conversations, to really whittle down to what's realistic. Because at the end of the day, you need a commercially successful product, and that's what's most important. And so I won't go through the numbers, but as you can see, we end up with somewhere between 650,000 and 800,000 patients. Now these are patients that receive repeat injections, so the market size is still on the order of $1 billion, but you know, it's much smaller than what you would anticipate if you looked at the initial larger market. So that's number one, I think. Really ask yourself, who are you trying to treat? And we decided to go after, not to go head-to-head against steroids, but to say, we'll take all those patients who can't get steroid injections, who fail steroids, and that's how we came to that market. And that was part of understanding the landscape. So who are the competitors out there? Well, there happens to be a drug delivery product with a steroid by Flexion, a public company that's in phase 3. And that helped us to see, you know, we really don't want to go head-to-head against them or head-to-head against steroids, but there's a huge market opportunity for being second line in this space, coming back to the clinical need. But you have to ask yourself about reimbursement. So how are you going to differentiate and prove to reimbursers that they should buy your product? Ask yourself, what's the likelihood of adoption? I think that's a big question that we had to go ask a lot of clinicians about, is, are you going to switch from you're so comfortable with steroids, you've been using them for decades, what's going to make you switch to a new product? And then feed that into the TPP. And then lastly, I think barriers to sales or adoption. Ask yourself, is the drug currently delivered that way? For us, the answer was yes, so that's not an issue. But imagine that you take a product that's given orally and you say, oh, it's no problem, everyone will just inject this, but maybe that's not the standard of care or practice, and to actually go and build out a new product area or new delivery method is quite challenging. So I think you also have to be thoughtful about what other barriers might be there for sales or adoption. So as I mentioned, a hydrogel, we put together a target product profile. This is just kind of a brief overview of that. For our lead program, which is a generic small molecule incorporated into the silk hydrogel and injected into the knee joints, with the idea that we could provide local efficacy but better safety profile, because now the drug is concentrated locally. We can bridge to studies by looking at what is the systemic concentration of the drug when injected locally. We've shown it's about 1,000 to 2,000-fold lower. And so now you can say, okay, here's all the safety data on oral. We're well below the tissue target concentrations to cause side effects, and therefore we don't have to go do a very large safety study with this product is the goal. And of course that will be, we'll be talking to the FDA about that. But ultimately aiming for an every 3-month injection, so 2 months of release. So I thought finally on point number 3, just really talk about capital efficiency and how you can leverage the 505(b)(2) pathway when you're having conversations with investors or partners. So I think the major positives are you can use a 505(b)(2) pathway as a way to prove a platform. So for us, silk fibroin has never been used as a drug delivery tool. It's been used as a silk suture material in other devices, but we want to take this new material and really be able to leverage and expand that to other molecules, other disease areas. And that is one real advantage of using the 505(b)(2) program up front. And with Camargo's help, which I'll talk about in a second, you can really plan for that. So you can plan early in your first product to talk about, well, is the intention here to build a broader platform? Is the intention for a one-off product? And that changes your regulatory strategy. It changes the conversations you have with the FDA. So for us, we're looking to try to get this really designated as an excipient, a novel excipient that's thought to be useful in a number of areas. As Ken mentioned, you can use existing data, which I won't talk about here. But I think it's a really de-risked approach to drug development, so that's the thing that I think investors sometimes underestimate but can be very valuable. We know this drug, we know the safety profile, we know it works, so it's just a matter of can you get it in the right place for the right amount of time. So in terms of the risks of failing because of safety or efficacy, certainly can still happen, but you have a much higher potential of success than these NCE counterparts where there's no clinical data in existence. But I think it's important to also acknowledge some of the drawbacks of the 505(b)(2), especially as an early stage company. There are a number of investors who simply do not invest in 505(b)(2) programs and don't invest in drug delivery. So I think you really have to ask yourself, who are those investors that are interested? They will say that you're less valuable than an NCE counterpart, but that's where the market comes in. If you've defined your market and you've really demonstrated why this is a product, not a reformulation play, and I think that goes to your point, then it's hard for them to argue because they can see that there's a value here on the market side, and pricing, that comes into the question as well. So I think you have to know going into the conversations that you're going to have to really have thought everything out to have a full argument to some of these investors who prefer NCE approaches. And that comes back to IP, which again, we don't have a lot of time today to go into, but there's always going to be questions about what's going to enable them to have the protection that they would get from composition of matter IP on the NCE side. But I always like to be an optimist, so I think there's some advantages here in that there are lots of non-traditional investors who really like the 505(b)(2) space because it's, again, the capital requirements are a lot less than what you'd need for an NCE drug. So it enables you to think outside the box. So as I mentioned, I think really thinking, map out your timelines, map out your needs. For us, our timelines are not that much shorter than an NCE program because you still have to go show the drug works. And I think that's the key assumption that people make that's often incorrect. Again, starting from the end point, what patient population are you going to address and what studies do you have to do to get the label indication that you want? But you can think outside the box to high net worth individuals, family offices, angel investors. There's disease foundations and grants and strategic collaborations, lots of ways to get capital into a 505(b)(2) company. So again, don't take the no from certain VCs as there's no capital out there, but think creatively about how you can leverage the positives of a 505(b)(2) pathway. So lastly, I think to Ken's points, really important to think end to end. So especially with a 505(b)(2) program, and there's a whole host of studies from preclinical feasibility, biocompatibility, all the way through to commercial studies. And if you don't plan it all the way out, you can build a bridge to nowhere. And that's important not to do in this space because most certainly people are going to ask on the investment side, what's your ultimate regulatory plan? What's your ultimate reimbursement plan? And if you haven't thought those out, it may seem like a very attractive, quick path to a product, but again, you need that whole path really well established to be able to be convincing as an early stage company. So I think this is what differentiates Camargo from other regulatory consultants in the industry. They really take an approach that is an extension of your team, and they really take the end-to-end approach, which is let's map out where you want to go and what your overall vision is as a company, and then let's work backwards to what steps we have to put in place to make you most successful. So rather than we'll do this first and then we'll see what happens, it's a end-to-end, let's plan it out, and we'll then go back and start on marching up those stairs to what is hopefully a good and approved product that has commercial success. And a couple of other things about, I think, Camargo that differentiate is we really see them as an extension of our team. There's sort of trust and alignment in what we're trying to achieve. And for example, you know, most of the drugs last year, I think, that were put on hold by the FDA and didn't get approval were from CMC manufacturing. And that's an area where Camargo has deep expertise in CMC. We don't have the capacity to build out our own CMC expertise. And so one of the, I think the most important things that we're doing early is really establishing what are those questions on the CMC side that we have to outline. That is something that, you know, I think can be overlooked and can get you into trouble when you first go to talk to the FDA. So, you know, I can't speak highly enough of Camargo's approach and this team-based aspect of really being a partner all the way through to the end is something that I think is really important as a 505(b)(2) program, especially if you intend to leverage that platform to other products. So we'll stop there.
Yeah, so, you know, what do you do after this planning? This whole planning part culminates into this meeting with the FDA, this pre-IND meeting. Can't emphasize that importance enough. We actually did a webinar a couple weeks ago on pre-IND, and if you have interest in learning more about that whole process, let us know and we can get you the link. It's a free link to the webinar. But the key is you have to do this planning ahead of time, and then get the FDA's concurrence, and then sticking with that plan, or at least communicating that the FDA about changes along that plan. And the FDA, it's amazing how much, let's say, once you've got this concurrence and understanding how the FDA is more of a colleague in future drug development, it's pretty amazing to see the distinct difference between this kind of drug development and the things I've done in the past, for example, on B1, where you're constantly trying to figure out what's going on next. So, questions? Oh, I got a couple. Yeah, sure.
So the IP consideration is really important, right? And I'm curious, in your instance in Cocoon, is it you married a delivery platform with a generic or something, right? And so do you have formulation IP around that, or is it an application kind of combination of the formulation and reformulation?
Yeah. So we filed IP about a year ago that covers formulation, but it actually also has composition of matter-like claims. So we were able to show distinctly that the particular NSAID we chose had a unique interaction, and that's important because it's not just formulation and application, but now we're claiming that interaction that enables us to have a little bit broader protection. It's still not quite the same as a pure composition of matter of a small molecular protein drug, but yeah, you really have to think through that carefully. And I think there are interesting ways. The thing I'd be careful about is just an application patent, because obviously, right, if the formulation claims are a little bit, if someone could design around it, it's going to be hard to be convincing, and ultimately to a partner. You might get investment, but you know, a partner who wants to sell and distribute this product is going to look very intensely at how likely is it for someone to just recreate the same thing. So again, it's going to differ by application, but for us, we've been really fortunate in that when we find the right drug, it seems to interact in a novel way. We can capture that in a composition of matter-like claims.
So in your platform view of the IP, though, which sounds like you do have, I mean, given that you've kind of paired, you've got this little bit novel situation of your delivery platform and the application and formulation aspect of it, when you go to kind of broaden your indication base, how does that play with your patent, your IP? Do you have to completely reiterate because of the unique combination? So
we have, we licensed out of a university, Tufts, and so we have broad-based IP that covers drug delivery for any indication, any disease area. And then what we plan to do is build product-specific IP. So that's the other thing in the 505(b)(2) space. Great, you really do need a foundation of broad-based IP, but then you will have to, ultimately you want product-specific IP as well. So yes, for each, what we intend to do is for new products, whether it's NCE drugs or existing drugs, to file additional IP around each product as we build out products, but continue to maintain and build upon that platform IP as well. So that's how I would think about it for any 505(b)(2) company, is, especially for a platform. You know, what is your platform play? Make sure you have broad-based coverage, but then don't forget that products are what sell, not platforms. So ultimately, make sure that you cover that product with IP that will, you know, upstand rigor later down the road.
Nice.
There's clearly a couple camps on IP in terms of 505(b)(2). There's certain companies that literally have very weak IP, if any at all. sometimes they rely on know-how as opposed to formal IP. And at this point in the marketplace, 505(b)(2) I still say is probably still in the toddler phase in terms of product knowledge. If you look at the number of generics of 505(b)(2) products, it's vanishingly small. There's very few 505(b)(2) products that have been approved that actually have a generic of them. Very few. Great question, why? Huh?
Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the reasons is manufacturing is so hard. I mean, we were actually talking to a manufacturer who listed how actually a lot of people are doing trade secret or know-how because they say, why waste all this money? Because no one can recreate it. Not that they can, I shouldn't say no one, but it can be recreated, but you have to spend millions of dollars and a lot of effort and time from CMC to manufacturing that's a barrier in and of itself. So I think it's actually...
I use that know-how, because they're using know-how as opposed to IP. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons. They don't need the, quote, traditional composition of matter IP. I could say, we've been in this business for 14 years. The first few years, you couldn't find any investors because they were traditionalists. They want, where's the composition of matter and so forth. And as this market's evolved, the investors have gotten more savvy. They see what's actually going on. They see some of the good and the bad. We have lots of experiences now. And so there's these two camps still, but there's a lot more investors. I mean, there's a lot of investment money now for 505(b)(2)s.
So with that data you just cited, and the question why, I mean, how do you view the marketplace then? Do you view this as a huge untapped opportunity for people to look at promising, indications that are underserved and look at the generics and move toward the reformulation play and leverage the 505(b)? Oh,
there's no doubt. A few years ago at this convention of bio, you probably have seen 5-10 companies that had B2 as part of their strategy. I don't know, we have 150, something like that, 160 companies that are at bio with 505(b)(2) strategy. I mean, it's just amazing that the amount of projects, for us, for example, the number of projects is just skyrocketing. And the market's evolved from, I'll call them simple stuff, the low-hanging fruit type of thing, to things that are more meaningful, such as what Cocoon's doing, finding more meaningful markets. For example, we're on our 29th orphan drug, and we've saved lives. So this is not just trivial stuff where we're making a slight change. We're finding existing drugs that can actually save lives. Talk about patient-centered. They were dying before. Every conditions where every person had died. So there's some profound changes being identified now, and people are understanding better how to use this. And I hope, like the seminar we did today, it helps go towards that. It helps educate the market that these things can be a very viable business strategy, very high ROI, and we're doing well for patients at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think if you look at biotech, if you take the overall statistics on whatever 90–95% fail rate of new drugs, it's just not sustainable. I mean, I think in the end, and I was at a meeting with the senator of Massachusetts and the governor, and they were both talking about how they really want to push biotech to start thinking about how do we take drugs that are on the shelf that had all this great data but failed because of a safety concern. Now you put it in a new formulation, and that's a drug that could save lives, right? And I think, in my mind, it's interesting. As a clinician, I don't see a difference between a 505(b)(2) and a novel drug in terms of value, so long as it meets that endpoint. And I think that's the culture shift that we're starting to see, is I think to date, the sexy new drugs have always gotten the higher price tags or the larger value, but if you define value as, does it help a patient, and is it improving some endpoint that's really important to reimbursers, I think we need to be agnostic to kind of what the drug substance is. But again, I think that's where we're going to see things shift too, is government regulators, or essentially Medicare, is going to start to say, wait, we don't want to pay for a brand new shiny drug if this other option is less expensive and can get us the same endpoint. So I think there's a lot of room for new opportunities.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.